Mention written communication, and most people immediately call you out for being old school. Yet today, more than ever before, most of our communication is actually written. In fact, many argue that verbal communication is now a thing of the past. From email to text messages, we spend most of our days writing to customers, team members, friends, and even family. Unfortunately, while technology has made written communication faster and easier, it has not made it better. More often than not, it's made it worse. From misunderstandings to misinterpreted messages, our writing can be our downfall. But are there shortcuts or techniques or forgotten rules that can help us make this better? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for joining me here today on A Seat at the Table. It is my pleasure to have written communications expert Rob Ashton with us today. In 1998, Rob founded Emphasis, a global learning company that has enabled more than 80,000 people to make much more impact with their professional writing. His advice has been sought by everyone from tech giants in Silicon Valley to the royal household at Buckingham Palace. Rob has been investigating brain science of reading and writing for more than 6 years, giving him a unique insight into why so much of our written communication fails. He says writing is the invisible medium, hidden in plain sight. Today, Rob will be talking about typical mistakes that can make many of the messages we write backfire, what a neural circuit breaker is, and why they stop us from getting the decisions we want, the real and surprising reason that email makes us angry, and why it's often better not to write, but to talk instead. One of the most difficult things to write is a job description. I always struggle with this, and yet it's a critical part of being able to attract the right talent to your business. The competition to find top talent and fill those critical positions is one of the biggest challenges companies face these days, especially in certain markets. That's why top corporations and even smaller enterprises rely on AsiaNet consultants to help them fill key positions. Since 1988, AsiaNet has been working in partnership with its global clients to help them make the right strategic hires. They have a well-earned reputation for being able to fill even those difficult-to-fill positions. So if you need to recruit new talent, or you think you might be doing that soon, head on over to their website. That's AsiaNetConsultants.com. AsiaNetConsultants.com. Now let's learn from Rob how to improve our written communication. Rob, I am really thrilled to have you on A Seat at the Table. I think what you have to talk about is something that many people are going to find incredibly useful. I know I'm keen to hear what you have to say, so thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think if we just dive into it, your expertise is in communicating effectively through the written word, if I'm understanding that. And I hope I haven't misinterpreted what you do. But it's certainly something that we all face, because in business we do a wide variety of writing. We don't think of ourselves as writers, but as you point out, from critical reports that you have to prepare for management or possibly for investors, even to simple emails, we actually do a lot of writing. And you point out that many of the messages we write backfire. Why is this? What are we doing wrong? What should we be doing differently?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It's all about writing and pretty much nothing else. Writing is something that we take for granted. It's something we've become increasingly reliant on, or almost without noticing. I set up a consultancy to look at this called Emphasis back in 1998. And back then, people were talking about whether we would be doing less writing and whether writing was on the way out, whether
Right.
this was a skill that was going to become redundant. And what's happened is the opposite. We've become almost totally reliant on writing. We just don't realize it. We don't see it as such. You might think of sending emails. We don't think so much of writing emails.
Right.
We're far more likely to send an instant message or a text message than to pick up the phone. In fact, if my phone rings, I assume something's wrong.
Right.
So it's this activity that's just become hidden in plain sight, and it's like a common thread that runs through everything we do, not just our working lives, but our personal lives too. People stay for hours in text messaging and trying to resolve complex issues, when in fact, they could probably resolve it a lot more quickly if they weren't in text messaging, but we stay stuck in it. We keep doing it. It's something that draws us in. We're far more likely to write to people than to speak to them unless they're in the same room as us. And sometimes even when they're in the same room as us, it's just something that's become more pervasive. In fact, the latest data is that last year we were sending 319 billion email messages, sending and receiving 319 billion email messages every day. And that figure's
Wow.
going up by 15 to 20 billion per day per year. And that doesn't take account of these instant messaging platforms that are spoken about, and things like, and alternatives like WhatsApp and Slack in work, social media, much of which is written. You do these days, it seems to be writing all the way. We just don't really, it's almost like we don't notice it.
You know, it's interesting you point that out, and I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. People were saying that, well, now that we have email and, like you said, all the messaging apps, nobody's talking to each other anymore, and nobody's going to be writing anymore. And as it turns out, everybody is writing. I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that either until you brought it up. Now, you mentioned that, oftentimes we're not communicating effectively through our writing. I mean, what are we doing wrong? Where do you see the train jumping the tracks?
Yeah, I think it comes down to probably two things. One is underestimating the complexity of reading and writing. It's something we take completely for granted. And this is why I think we don't notice the written word or realize we're relying on the written word. And the other is that we overestimate our capacity, our mental capacity for information. And those two things are connected. So let me explain. Written communication is something that we didn't evolve to do. Okay. It's something that our brains, we're not born with brains that are set up for reading. Now that's very different from speaking and listening. We evolved to speak and listen, not to read and write. So if you look at the human brain in an infant, newborn infant, it has both it's almost pre-programmed to learn to speak and to listen to language. It's pre-programmed to be receptive to spoken language. And you see this with children. They pick up their native language without being taught to do it. They pick it up passively just by, as long as they're surrounded by people who are speaking, as long as people are speaking to them, then they will develop their native language. And even they'll learn the grammar of it. They won't know the terms, of course, but they'll work out the rudiments of grammar and how to structure a sentence. And, you can even see this in kids where they make grammar mistakes. And it's because they've picked it up. So instead of saying, take the word lie and say, he lied, and they put a D on the end, and they know that that's the grammar there. But if they might take the word see and say he seed it instead of he
Right.
saw it. So that they're starting to get it. Now that doesn't happen with reading and writing. This is why it takes us so long. It takes us years. You can't teach yourself to read just by looking at text. And we know this because if you take an alphabet that you're not familiar with, so I don't know, it could be Hebrew, could be Arabic, and you look at those letters, they won't mean anything to you. And you could stare at them all day, every day, and they still won't mean anything to you. You need this dedicated study. You need dedicated tuition. So it's complex. Reading is really complex. It involves wiring together lots of different parts of the brain that we evolve for other things. It involves multiple parts of the brain, and it's hard. So we learn to do this, and then we take it for granted, but that effort reduces, but it never goes away entirely. So
Right.
reading and writing are harder than speaking and listening. So when we're reading something, we can take in less information, and we have less capacity for thought and emotional control. And the same as when we're writing. If we're trying to get a point across when we're writing, there's a limit. There's a limit to the capacity, and it's a much smaller limit than there would be if we were speaking and listening. And that's where it goes wrong, because we think that writing is just a case of transferring information from one head to another, and that if we do that, I just give them the information and they will make a decision and they will see what I'm talking about, and I will get the result I'm after. And in fact, what often happens is the opposite.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And you're right. We don't really think about it until you brought this up now. I hadn't really thought about the process behind learning to read and write versus learning to speak a language. So it's really interesting what you're bringing up. How do we overcome some of this? How might we approach it differently?
I think the first thing is to just be aware. So even just being aware that writing is different and reading are different from speaking and listening. That you just need to know that if I'm using the written word, if I'm texting, if I'm emailing, if I'm responding to somebody on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, I'm commenting, there's a limit to it's a psychologists call it a low capacity channel. Okay. So there's a limit to how much you can get across. And I don't just mean the words, I mean the emotions, the feeling, the tone. So just know that if you are writing, you are already at a disadvantage. So be aware. And then the next thing is to question really whether what you are doing, whether writing is the best way to convey that information, and whether really you should be speaking to the person, and that you should be going to see them, or you should be picking up the phone. I mentioned about being stuck in text conversations. Some of those can be arguments that last for hours. And if you just move that phone from in front of your face up to your ear and speak to the person, you can probably resolve it in a few minutes. There is something that happens here. Some research a number of years ago that looked at what happens in our bodies, what happens in our brains, what hormones are released, how things change when we're reading compared with when we're listening. And it found that when we listen to somebody, we release oxytocin. And oxytocin it's been called the hug hormone or the love hormone. But that's oversimplifying it, but it's something that is essential for social interaction, it modulates our emotions and our thoughts and what we're saying. And that's released when you hear someone's voice, when you hear a human voice. But when you are reading, what this research showed is that it's not released. Now, it was just a couple of pieces of research, and I think there's definitely more work to do on that. But I think what that does is hint at the difference, just how we respond to reading and writing versus, or rather, how we respond to the human voice. You can be stuck in an argument on email, and I've done this myself. I was in a tense situation on Slack, the instant messaging system we used in our office, and I asked somebody for an update on a project, and there was something in his response that made me think he's getting upset. I said, "Can I have an update?" Right. And he said, "Why?" And it was like, "Oh, just that one word," Right. And we tried to resolve it on Slack, and after just 2 or 3 messages, you could just see this thing was going south. This was going to get really tense. And he had the presence of mind just to say, "Can we have a chat?" And I, said, type back, "Yeah, sure." And he came into my office, and we started speaking, and I've got to tell you, as soon as we started speaking, it was almost magical. Right. My shoulders dropped, his shoulders dropped. We both relaxed, and you could almost feel something kind of flowing through you, like kind of an emotion washing over you, a kind of a mutual understanding building. If that research is right, that could be very real. That could be oxytocin being released. If you've got something that's really difficult to understand, and you're trying to get multiple points across, pick up the phone. If you've got something that's emotionally challenging, pick up the phone. Don't try to use writing for that, because it's a lot of heavy lifting and it's too much for it, really.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because in writing, being able to write dialogue is very difficult. It takes a tremendous skill to be able to capture that emotion in the written word and convey it. So certainly for those of us who are not professional at writing, it's not easy. And I think you're right about the fact that if you just talk to people, but I suppose people feel intimidated, right, to call someone. They feel that you almost feel like you have You can hide behind, I suppose, not wanting to say it that way, but can't think of a better way to say it. You can hide behind an email more easily than having to actually talk to someone.
Totally. And I think this is why it's this idea that we're not communicating is not quite right. Communicating more than we've ever done. We send far more emails and text messages than we ever used to speak to each other, or, go back to a long way back, letters. We're sending all of these things. We're writing all of these things, which if you think, go back to the 1970s, it would have been memos, which email evolved from there. Go back further than that, it would have been letters. And of course, in-person meetings, phone calls. We are communicating way more now that we're using these text-based platforms, tools. It's partly, I think, that, yeah, we do feel protected by this, but it's partly also that it enables us to communicate more than we might have done before. It's just that sometimes all of that communication is a good thing. That there is something else going on, though, to your point about whether it's hiding or not. And I think that's because we see our screens as an extension of our brains. So we live in this screen or on this screen. If you get stuck on your phone, that phrase, you're stuck on your phone. It's because your phone feels part of you when you're looking at it. And when you're typing on a screen, those words that appear on that screen are just a kind of a manifestation of your thoughts. Okay. And you're reading them back and they make sense to you. But as soon as you press send, it's a very different thing that the other person is going to receive. And part of the reason for that is those words are not a complete manifestation of your thoughts. They are just part of it. They're one part of the signal. And the bit that you're hearing as well, that they can't hear, that the recipient can't hear, is the voice in your head.
Right,
it's the
exactly.
thoughts that go with it. And it's like a backing track. We have this inner monologue. And when we're typing, we hear the tone. We know what we mean. We have all the background. We know things. You can't unknow things. And then the recipient doesn't have that voice that's in your head. They have the voice that's in their head. And they probably don't have your background knowledge. And they can't detect, or they can try to detect your emotions. But usually it's very, very difficult. It can be a rough approximation, and obviously it can go really wrong. And they have this voice in their head. And, it's kind of like they have their own backing track. And you're trying to get them to listen to yours, which they can't hear anyway, because it's just in your head and not in theirs. So it's much more complex than we think. That we really overestimate how much people can understand from our communication, how much people can kind of intuit what we might be thinking. There was a study around 10 years ago where, forgive me, it was a lot longer. It's in the early 90s, actually. Apologies. But it's called Tappers and Listeners. There's a psychologist at Stanford University. And what she did was she got people to tap out well-known tunes, well-known songs, and to estimate. So when I mean tap out, I just mean, tap on the desk, tap on a board. So just the rhythm of the tune, and to estimate how many people out of 100 would be able to guess the tune from the tapping. And they were well-known tunes like, Happy Birthday or something like that. And the tappers estimated that around half of the listeners would be able to name the tune just from their tapping. But the actual figure was 2.5% on average.
Oh, really?
Just 2.5%. Yeah. So we vastly overestimate how much information people can get from our communication, rather how much that almost, I guess what we're saying is we overestimate their ability for telepathy. It's kind of
right.
And yet we base an awful lot of our communication on that. We assume that they're party or privy to thoughts when they're not.
Now that we know that you shared that, how can we use that knowledge in a sense to either influence the decisions by those we lead or report to, or just people we're communicating with? How do we take that and put practical application?
Well, it's a vast topic, so there's no short answer, and I'm not going to try to give you the long one, don't worry. But I think that, first of all, just be aware of what writing is. You think of it as reading. Reading is seeing dots and squiggles on a page or on a screen and hearing a voice in your head. So your job is to make it the right voice, because seeing dots and squiggles and hearing a voice, that's a miracle of adaptation. It's hard work. So just know straight away that what you are doing is far more complex than it may appear. But also, there are some things you can do. So I would say that, for instance, don't overcomplicate things. It's complex already, so don't overcomplicate things. Be selective. You are probably going to overestimate how much information somebody can take on board from your writing. We used to have this idea of a magic number 7, where we could take in 7 pieces of information. And that dates back to research in the 50s. It's more like 3. That research has been updated. It's more like 3. Sometimes it's as low as 2. When you're reading something, you're using your working memory to kind of hold this information in your temporary memory while you're making decisions. And that can get overloaded very, very quickly. And you will overestimate how much that person can take on board. You'll overestimate how much they know about the topic, because you will underestimate. If you know a lot about a topic, you will underestimate how much you really know. And you will overestimate how much other people know. So you will end up giving them way too much information. And if you overdo that, the effect will be that you will get either a very strange decision or no decision. So you very easily overload the brain and get no decisions. So reduce the amount of information you give. And the next thing I would say is make sure you can capture their attention and that you can keep them reading. So make what you read easy to read. We have this idea that simple writing is kind of dumbing down,
Right.
somehow infantile and will undermine our credibility. But you should be trying to connect and impress people with your ideas, not with your language, not with your flowery words, because those things are harder to process. And if you give them stuff that's harder to process, remember, reading's difficult anyway. So the more effort they have to use to decode or decipher your flowery language, then the less capacity they will have to take on board your opinions and your recommendations. There's a psychology effect called the fluency heuristic, which means that the easier something is to process, the more likely we are to believe it and to be influenced by it. So you are helping yourself by making things easy to read. And I don't mean leave out all jargon. You should be using the words that, if you're going to use technical words, that's fine if they are the audience's technical words. If they're the words they use, that's great. But it's the words in between that cause the problem. You're using 3 or 4 words when you could just use 1. Those build up and you overload the decision maker's brain or the recipient's brain, and it usually backfires. So do the opposite. Make it easy to process and make it flow. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't use too much information.
Those are such good points, and I think you're right. We all fall into that trap of wanting to sound more professional, more polished, so we opt for bigger words or more complex sentence structures. And as you're pointing out, and I think quite correctly, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about actual examples myself, and I'm thinking, yeah, actually, he's right. It's so tedious to read that kind of thing, and you get lost in the words, so to speak. So, you point to the importance of a neural circuit break. Can you share a little bit about what that means and how we should be using that?
Yeah, so this was a neat piece of research on this, which looked at the activity in the brain in an area called, the name doesn't matter, but it's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but it's an area that's involved in decision making. Okay, it's involved in lots of other things, but it is central to decision making. And what the researchers did was they asked people to make decisions. They gave them something called a combinatorial auction, which is how airlines bid for slots for their planes. What they have to do is take into account lots of different factors, predict the price of fuel, predict availability of pilots, predict demand. So loads of things. So these things are really complex. And they used this in the experiment. They gave people that kind of decision. They gave them more and more information and asked them to make decisions. And what they noticed was that there came a point that the more information they gave them beyond a certain point, the less rational their decisions became. So they started to make really weird decisions. It's like, well, why would you do that? Why would you why would you decide to do that? That makes no sense. So that was interesting. But what they also found was that activity in this area of the brain, this decision-making area, beyond a certain point, just fell off a cliff. It just kind of shut down. And that's what I mean by this neural circuit breaker. If you give people too much information, for a start, you could get the decision you don't want, or an irrational decision, presumably both, presumably you want them to make a rational decision. But go beyond that and you'll get no decision at all. People would just freeze.
Yes.
And that ties in with other things. We have a thing called status quo bias, where when we're uncertain, we will stick with what we know. We'll stick with what we've got already.
True.
We have this default where we kind of think the more information you give, the easier it will be to make the decision. I'm going to give this person all the information they need, and then they will make the decision. And it doesn't work like that. That's not how the brain works. You can think of this sometimes if people want your advice. I mean, I've seen this in organizations where people will be asked by someone who's senior to them to write a report on something. And what that more junior person will do is just give them everything they know on it, everything they found out. And, if they wanted the internet, they would have used the internet.
Right.
When you're giving someone information to make a decision, be selective. Think, where are they? What do they need? What is most likely to influence them? How can I help? And then how can I be selective? What do they not need to know? If you're writing something, think, do they need to know this? Or am I just writing that to help my thinking or to show that I've done my homework? Because if that's the case, you're probably not helping as much as you think you are, and that could well backfire.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to point out, that again, you don't really think about it until someone like yourself brings it up and you point out why, and then you think to yourself, yeah, it makes perfect sense. So it's really interesting to sort of look at how we communicate and dissect. Now, you have some interesting thoughts on email, speaking of the devil, and you say that there's a real reason why email makes us angry. What's that?
Well, it applies to social media too.
Oh, okay.
and that's this idea of cognitive overload. When you're reading, you are already using up a lot more capacity than you think, which leaves less capacity for emotional control. But the other thing is that the other reason is that we can read email anywhere now, almost literally anywhere.
Yeah, you're right.
Maybe underwater in a swimming pool, we're not going to do that, but it's kind of everywhere else. We can read our email as long as we've got our phone with us.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
when you send an email to somebody, you have no idea where they're going to be when they receive it. And so it could be that it's not the email that's making them angry or making you angry, but you think it is. So another cognitive bias we have is called the affect heuristic, and it means that when we're experiencing a certain emotion, we will look for things around us that confirm that we're right to feel that emotion. And I've got an embarrassing example from my own life where I was looking for something in a closet under the eaves of my office here, and above this cupboard are steel girders. Okay. And I was rooting around for this, and I stood up and I banged my head on this steel girder, and I felt, it was awful. In fact, even as I describe it, I feel a shiver down my neck. It was really visceral. And then I kind of regained my composure after a few minutes, and I sat down at my desk, and there was an email from a conference organizer asking me something. And I looked at this and I just saw red. I just thought, what are you, stupid? Is kind of, that's a crazy idea. Why would you do that? And I replied in kind. I wasn't rude, I don't think, but I was quite terse. I certainly didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. I misinterpreted what he said, essentially, because I know this because after 20 minutes, when I calmed down properly, I looked at the email again, and it was perfectly benign. It was a perfectly reasonable request that he'd sent, and I totally misinterpreted it. And what I'd done is I'd overlaid my anger and pain from banging my head on top of his email. And we do this too. If you're in a traffic jam, or you're late for dropping the kids off at school, or you're running for a meeting, and in a misguided attempt, as we often do when we're stressed, we look at our phone to get some kind of relief. And you see an email, and if you're in a stress situation, then quite often you will think it's the email that's triggered you and that it's causing the problem. So it's those two things. The other thing is that most reading is, this is one thing I haven't mentioned, most reading is prediction. So we don't see what's there, we see what we expect to be there. And then our brain updates it. And we do this with all vision. Our eyes aren't sophisticated enough to take in all the things we see. I'm sat here in my home office. Outside, I can see the garden, I can see the sky, I can see the trees, I can see everything in front of me. And it's a very complex picture. My eye is not producing most of that. My brain is. Most of that activity comes from the brain. And your brain then takes the signal from the eye and updates it. And it's the same with when we're reading email. When we're reading it, we are predicting what it's saying, what it's going to say. So we're seeing what we expect to see, what's actually there, and your eye is checking. And this is why we miss our biggest mistakes, why we miss typos, or say we think we've said one thing when we've said another. It's because we are also seeing what we expect to see when we're writing or when we're reading back what we've written. So that is another reason that you send someone an email. They're often, and we do the same, when we're reading what we're expecting to see. So again, if you're wanting a decision, or if you're slightly irritated with someone, or if they haven't delivered for you before, then that you overlay your prejudgment, if you like, onto that, and you read what you expect to see. So that's another reason that can backfire, and another reason that any written communication, including social media, can also make us angry.
It's such a good point, and I think that's something that's very true. We don't really think about it from that point of view, but it is actually really accurate. Rob, what's the one piece of advice that you would give someone who wants to get more decisions to go their way?
I would say to do everything you can to put yourself in the recipient's shoes, in the decision maker's shoes. So think about what's important to them. By that, I don't mean what they need, but what they want. Because we don't do the things we need. We don't get the things we need. We get the things we want. Otherwise, we'd all be on healthy diets and we'd be signed up to gym memberships and actually using them. Put yourself in their shoes and say, okay, where are they coming from? Where are they likely to be when they receive this? What do I know about them? What clues do I have about what's important to them, what they know to be important to them? And then do everything you can to dissociate yourself from what you've written. So if you write the first draft, don't send it. Put some time delay, shut down your laptop, put your phone away, walk away. If you can, try to come back to it tomorrow, and everything will be screaming, send it, it's done, it's fine. Because at that point, you've got that voice in your head, you've got all that information, it will make perfect sense to you. So you need to allow that feeling and those thoughts to dissipate. So, and they will, if you walk away and go for a walk, or just allow an hour or two, you'll notice a difference. You'll notice that you're thinking differently when you come back to it. So think of the reader, and then try to get yourself out of the picture and allow your thoughts and your knowledge and your expectation, this prediction that what you've written makes sense. Allow all of that to wash through and dissipate before you go back to it and look and see what it's really saying, and try to anticipate how the decision maker is going to react. You can even send it to yourself. I would say if you're sending an email to them, the last thing you put in the email is the recipient's email address. So you can't send it accidentally. Right. But what I do and what I try to do is, if there's an attachment, I attach that first. I always forget that bit. Then I write the message. Then I allow myself time. And then I come back, and I was sending one last night. And I then at that point sent it to myself so that I could then see what it was like. Sent it from my laptop, looked at it on my phone, somewhere else, away from my desk, which also helps. Just anything you can do to anticipate how it will be received. And only when you've got that bit right do you put their name in the recipient box in your email program and send it.
Right. I think that's such great advice. Rob, you've shared so many interesting things with us here. How can people connect with you? Where can we find you?
I'm at robashton.com.
Okay.
So they can find out all about this stuff there. And there is, I have a free program actually, which I've put together, which covers all of this stuff and more. And if they can get that there, or they can go straight to it. If they just go to robashton.com/influence, robashton.com/influence, they can sign up there. It's a program called Silent Influence. For reasons it should be obvious, this is something we take for granted, and it's influencing us all the time.
Oh, that sounds fabulous. Well, I'm going to put all these links in the show notes so that people can have an easier time to connect with you. And I want to thank you so much for being on a seat at the table and for sharing so much valuable information with us.
Jane, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I'd also like to thank our sponsor, AsiaNet Consultants. AsiaNet's a specialist in recruiting top talent in Asian markets. Since 1988, AsiaNet has been working in partnership with its global clients to help them make the right strategic hires. They have a well-earned reputation for being able to fill even those difficult-to-fill positions. Learn about how they can help you find the best talent by heading over to their website, asianetconsultants.com. That's asianetconsultants.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me here on A Seat at the Table. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something from it, I would love to hear about it. If you'd like to support the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you can take a minute to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or other channels, that would be fabulous. Don't forget to check out our podcast website, seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com. If there's something you'd like to share, ideas, suggestions, or comments, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining me and being part of our international community. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.